Before first light on the cold Sunday, a week before Advent, the sound that carried down the frozen valley was the long iron scrape of a bread peel dragged across the floor of a brick oven, and then a knuckle knocking soft against a dark crust to hear whether it rang hollow, and then the scrape again, and again, and again, patient as a clock that had been taught to wait. Coming out of a low stone house at the head of the old chestnut grove, where no lamp had burned in the memory of anyone living, and where 3 autumns before not one man in the county would have tied his horse after dark. By the time the sky went the color of skimmed milk, the road below the grove had filled, and it kept filling. Wagons and hand sleds and men on foot and women with market baskets held flat against the cold, and they did not push, and they did not call out to one another. They only stood and waited, and took their hats off as they came up to the door, the way a person takes his hat off at a graveside or at a christening, holding it against the chest with both hands, because some part of every one of them had come to understand at last that they had walked up to a place that asked it of them. There was old Merritt near the front who had once spat in the road at the mention of her name, and there was the miller's own foreman standing with his cap crushed in his fist, and there was a girl of 9 who had been sent up from town with a sled and $1 and a folded list, and not a soul among them said the thing they were all thinking, which was that they should have believed sooner. Inside, in the red light off the oven mouth, a young woman moved between the drying racks and the long table and did not hurry. She was small and plain, and her sleeves were shoved past the elbows, and there was ash to her forearms and flour to the wrist, and she was counting. She counted the loaves as she drew them, aloud but under her breath, the way she had counted everything for as long as the county had known her, and a good while before that. And she set each one up on its edge to cool along the board, and made one short mark in a ledger that lay open at the end of the table with a stub of pencil tied to it on a string, and then she went back for the next one, and she did not look up at the door. She had learned a long time before that looking up was a thing a person did for herself and not for the work, and the work was what fed them. The loaves came out of the oven dark as turned earth and heavy as a river stone of the same size, and there was no wheat in a single one of them. They were made of chestnuts. They were made of 900 pounds of wind-fallen chestnuts that everyone from the mill on the river to the bench in front of the store had called spoiled waste, rot on the ground, hog-mast gone soft in the wet, and that she had hauled off 3 autumns before, all 900 pounds of it, for $7. $7. Remember that. Remember the $7 and the 900 pounds and the 3 autumns, because at the far end of this, the very same 3 numbers will be standing there in the road waiting for you, and they will mean the flat opposite of what they meant on the afternoon the whole county laughed. For what not one of them in that long line yet let themselves know was that the low stone house the red light was coming from had not been built by her, and had not been built for her, and had stood at the dead center of that grove under briar, and 40 years of leaf fall, long before the oldest name on any stone in the churchyard was ever cut, waiting, the way a thing waits that was made well by careful hands, and then forgotten, its oven sound under all that ruin, its chimney stopped with birds' nests, its door long since rotted off the hinge. She had not gone looking for it. She had not known it was there. The grove had led her to it. The worthless thing had led her to it, foot by foot and season by season, and that is the true spine of the whole matter. And it stood at the middle of everything that morning, the way it stood at the middle of the trees. But that is the heart of the story and not the front of it. And a story shaped like this one has to be carried up from the front, or it cannot be carried at all. So set down the loaves and the line and the $7 for the length of a breath, and go back. Go back to the trees themselves, and to what slept in the middle of them. The grove stood on a played-out shoulder of ground at the top of the valley, 40-some big trees and a scatter of young ones, chestnuts every one, tall and broad and older than the road, and for 2 generations men had walked past them, the way you walk past a thing that is only in the way. In the fall they let down their mast in a brown rain, and the hogs that were turned into the woods grew fat on it, and the deer came in from the ridges for it, and the children filled their pockets on the way to school, and that was the whole account the county kept of them. But at the center of the grove, where the ground leveled and a cold spring came up through moss, there was a hummock in the trees that the briar had claimed so completely that the deer trails went around it, and the hunters called it the old rock pile and thought no more about it, and it was not a rock pile. It was a house of dressed stone with a slate roof half fallen in, and inside it, whole, was a bread oven of hard brick with an arched mouth and a deep floor, a baker's oven built to feed a place that no longer existed, and it had been waiting there in the dark and the leaf fall for the better part of 40 years for somebody with the patience to find it. An old man had built it. That was all anybody could have told you, and hardly anybody could have told you even that. Long before the mill and the store and the church that stood there now, a man had come up into that valley and planted those trees on purpose. In rows you could still make out if you knew to look. A man out of some old country of stone mountains where a family lived or died by its chestnuts because nothing else would take root on the rock, and he had built himself a stone bakehouse at the heart of his planting and set a good oven in it, and meant, plainly, to make his bread the way his people had always made it. And then he had died, or gone, or been buried under one of the blank stones no one could read anymore, and the valley that grew up afterward had forgotten him so thoroughly that it forgot even to wonder who had set 40 chestnut trees in careful rows on a hill, and the woods took the little stone house back, patient and quiet and sure, and closed over the oven and kept it. And it was a good oven, which is the whole reason it kept. For a poor oven falls in a single season, its bricks falling apart at the first hard freeze that finds a cracked joint in bad mortar, but this one had been laid up by a man who had built ovens before and knew that the arch is everything, and the floor is everything, and that a stone house set over the whole of it against the weather is not a comfort, but the difference between 40 years and 4. He had chosen his brick and set it close and true and level, and he had roofed it in slate and floored it in cut stone and walled it round in rock 2 hands thick, and then he had gone away and let the trees come down over all of it, and the oven had done the one thing a good oven does when it is left alone, which is nothing at all, patiently, for as long as it took. It did not crack. It did not fall. It held its arch and kept its floor with the cold spring running past the door, a made thing biding in the dark for the hand that would light it again, and there is no hurry at all in a thing like that, and there was none in this one. Nobody living knew the oven was there. Not the miller who owned the river, not the storekeeper who owned the county's debts, not the farmer whose fence corner touched the grove, and least of all the young widow who would come 3 autumns before that Advent morning and pay $7 for a heap of rotting nuts, and, without knowing it, for the ground they rotted on, and for a house of stone she had never seen, and for an oven that had been kept sound all those years by nothing but the good sense of the man who first laid it up. The buried thing does not hurry. It had been fed to a fire once, and it was made to be fed to a fire again, and it did not care how long that took, and it did not tell her it was there. It let the trees tell her. It let the fallen mass tell her. It waited to be found the way the whole rest of this waited to come true, and it is the thing you must hold in the back of your mind through every part of what follows, because in the end the story comes back to that oven and stops there, glowing, and does not go out. Now step back the whole way, to the spring before any of it, when she had nothing at all. Her name was Della Ames, and she was 24 years old the year her life came apart, and it came apart the way most lives do in a place like that, quietly and completely, and without anybody to blame. She had married a man named Tom Ames who worked the trip hammer at the forge below the mill, and they had rented 2 rooms at the ragged edge of town, and a strip of garden and a shed, and they had been poor and steady, and about to be less poor, and then on a wet morning in April, a shaft let go at the forge, and a length of iron swung, where a man was standing, and Tom Ames was carried home on a door, and he lived 2 days, and on the 3rd he did not. She was 24. She had been married 19 months. She had no child, and no people of her own nearer than a grave in another county, and no trade but the keeping of a poor house. And when the burying was paid for, she sat down at the table on which he had been laid out, and she counted. Because counting was the one thing she had always been able to do when there was nothing else to be done, and this is exactly what she owned. She owned 1 iron kettle and 1 smaller pot, and a skillet with a cracked handle she had bound with wire. She owned the bed and the table and 2 chairs, one of them mended. She owned her clothes and his, and she would sell his. She owned a hoe and a mattock and an axe and a froe and a draw knife and a set of forge tools she could not use and would have to sell for 1/10 of their worth to men who knew it. She owned 3 hens and half of a 4th, the other half being owed against feed to the storekeeper, whose name was Tolliver, and whose ledger she was written into for $11.40 she could not pay. She owed 2 months on the rent of the 2 rooms, at $1.50 the month, to a man named Hoke, who owned that corner of town, and a good deal else besides. She had, when the burying was settled and the debts were counted and the last of Tom's wages was collected from a foreman who looked at the floor while he counted it into her hand, $4 and some odd cents, and a winter coming, and no money coming behind it, and the pity of a whole town settling down over her like the first cold rain of the year. That was the inventory. A precise list is a truer portrait than any painter ever made, and that was the whole of hers. She sold what she could that first month, and she sold it the way the poor always sell, into a buyer's market with her need showing plain, and she knew to the penny how badly she was used, and let no one see that she knew. The forge tools went to a smith over the ridge for $2.25, tools worth 10 if they were worth a dime, and he knew it and she knew it and neither of them said so. Tom's good coat and his boots went to a peddler for $1 even. The half-grown shoat she had no feed for went back to Tolliver against the account and knocked $1.60 off the $11.40, and she wrote the new figure in her own book the same night the storekeeper wrote it in his, and the two figures matched, because she never once in all her life let another man's ledger be the only ledger. She kept the hoe and the mattock and the axe and the froe and the draw-knife. For a person who means to work does not sell the tools of work. And she kept the kettle and the 2 pots and the cracked skillet bound with wire. And she kept the bed and the mended chair, and she kept, above all the rest of it, the little ruled book and the pencil tied on its string. She ate thin that first month. Cornmeal and what the 3 hens gave, and what the neighbors carried up until the neighbors stopped carrying, and she paid the rent to Hoke a $50 at a time, and stood there while he marked it, and she counted the coins in the tin every single night before she slept. Not because the counting changed the number, but because knowing the number exactly was the one power that had never once been taken from her, and it would prove in the end to be the only power she needed. The town, for its part, had already decided about her, and it had decided the hard way, which was not to despise her, but to be sorry for her. And there is no colder charity in the world than that. If they had hated her, she could have set her back against it, the way you set your back against a wind, but they did not hate her. They grieved at her, gently, out loud, over their gates and across the store counter, and in the pews on either side of hers. Poor Della Ames, poor thing. So young, and no people, and how would she manage? And wasn't it a shame? And they brought her a ham and a sack of meal the first week, and then went back to their own troubles, and left her the pity to live on, which does not keep and cannot be eaten. The kindest of them shook their heads. The kindest of them were the worst, because their kindness had already buried her beside her husband and moved on. And a person can feel that, can feel the whole weight of a town having quietly agreed that her story was over. And it is a heavier thing to carry than any insult. And it does not leave marks where anyone can see them. You could read it in the small things, the shape of the town's mind about her. When she came into the store, the talk did not stop the way it stops for someone a place is afraid of. It softened instead, went gentle and low and careful. And someone always rose to find her a chair, and Tolliver would knock a few cents off a thing without being asked, and not meet her eye while he did it. And the women would press her hand at the church door and tell her to be sure and come to them if ever she wanted for anything, meaning it, every one of them meaning it kindly, and not a single one of them ever once imagining that what she wanted was not a ham or a chair or a pressed hand, but only to be counted as a woman with a road ahead of her instead of a woman with a grave behind her. The widow Merritt, who had buried 2 husbands and built a whole life out of being pitied, took her aside after the burying and taught her the trick of it, how a body learns to live on what people give and to want no more than that, kindly, as one of the sorrowful to another, and Della Ames thanked her and went home and wrote in the book, under the day's weather, that she would not learn that trick, and did not write down why, and had no one to tell it to. For that was the whole loneliness of the thing. Not that they were cruel to her, but that they were finished with her, that they had closed her account in their minds, and paid it out in soft words and gone back to their own troubles. And a person can carry a mountain of scorn if she must, can set her shoulder against it and lean and make her way, but there is nothing at all to lean against in pity. It gives when you push on it. It wraps you soft and holds you still and asks you kindly to stay down where you are, and it is the hardest thing on this earth to climb up out of, harder by a long way than to stop hearing an insult, and she climbed up out of it slowly and alone, and told not one living soul that was what she was doing, because the single thing she owned that the town could not see was the very thing that would carry her up. But there was one thing about Della Ames that the town could not see, because it had never once thought to look, and it was the whole engine of everything that came after. She watched. She had always watched, from a child, the way some people are born watching, and she remembered what she watched, and she wrote it down. She could tell you which of Tolliver's barrels of meal had come in Weevily 2 Octobers running, and which hen in the county laid double-yolked, and what day the first ice skimmed the horse trough every year for 6 years back, because she kept a little book of it, a cheap ruled ledger she had carried since she was a girl, and in it she set down small true things in a small plain hand, weather and weights and prices and the tastes of things, and she tied a pencil to it on a string so as never to lose the pencil. It was the one extravagance of a life that had no others, a book for writing down what was so, and the town did not know she had it, and would have pitied her the more for it if it had. They saw a poor widow with a cracked skillet. They did not see that she was, and had always been, the one person in the whole valley who was keeping the record. Now the worthless thing itself, and where it came from, because nothing in this story was ever as simple as junk, and the chestnuts least of all. That autumn, the first autumn after Tom Ames died, the mast came down heavier than any man could remember, and then it came down all at once. There was a storm the 3rd week of October, a hard, warm wind out of the south ahead of a cold snap, and it blew for a day and a night, and it stripped the old grove on the hill as clean as a hand stripping a stalk, and it threw down chestnuts in a drift you could not walk through without wading, 900 pounds and more of them lying a foot deep across the ground under those 40 trees. And then the cold snap came in behind the wind, and then 3 days of rain on top of the cold, and that was the ruin of them, in the county's eyes. Chestnuts on the ground go over fast in the wet. The burrs rot, the shells go dark, a white mold gets into the split ones, and to a man walking past with his collar up, it looked like 900 pounds of spoiled mast turning to slime in the leaves, fit for hogs at best, and not fit for that if the mold got into it, and worth exactly nothing, and in everybody's way besides, because the grove stood in the fence corner of the Hoke place, and Hoke had been trying for 2 years to get it cleared, and the useless wooded acres struck from his tax roll. Men had tried to make a little something of that grove before, in a small way, and given it up, and that giving up was its own kind of lineage. A drover had once turned 50 hogs into it to fatten them on the mast, and lost 6 to a sickness he laid to the moldy nuts, and drove the rest out and told the whole county the grove was poisoned, which it was not, but the word stuck the way an easy word sticks. A storekeeper before Tolliver had bought 2 barrels of the sound nuts one fall thinking to sell them roasted in town, and watched them go soft and wormy in his cellar inside the month, and swore off them to his grave. A boy had gathered a sack to sell along the road, and been laughed back home. Every one of them had failed for the same one reason, that they had tried to use the chestnut green and whole and quick, the way a man uses a thing he does not respect. And the chestnut will not be used that way and never has been in all the long history of it. And so the grove had earned, fairly and over years, its good name as 40 trees worth of nothing, and the storm had done no more than heap the nothing higher. And here is the lineage of the thing, which is the part nobody in the county had ever bothered to learn. Chestnuts were beneath them. That was the plain truth of it. In an older country and an older time, the chestnut had been the tree that kept the poor alive through winters that killed everyone who had nothing else. The bread tree, the one crop that asked no plow and no seed corn and no hired man and gave its flour for free to whoever would gather it and had the patience to cure it. And whole nations of Stone Mountain people had lived 1,000 years on chestnut bread and called it the bread of the good God. But that knowledge had not crossed the water into that valley. In that valley the chestnut was hog feed. It was a thing children ate raw on a dare, and men roasted 3 of at a fire and threw the rest to the pigs, and nobody in 2 generations had thought to do the one patient thing that turns a nut into bread, which is to dry it a long time and grind it fine, because nobody in that valley had ever been hungry enough or old enough or foreign enough to remember that it could be done. Every conventional use of the thing had failed because there was no conventional use. You could not sell a chestnut for money because nobody bought them. You could not keep them because green off the tree they molded in a week. You could not make a meal of them boiled because they turned to a mash a body soon sickened of. They were, by every account the county kept, worthless, and the storm had only made a great heap of worthless out of what had always been a small one. And Hoke wanted it hauled off his ground, and he did not much care by whom, and he was willing to pay a little, or take a little, to see the back of it. And that is how it came to be for sale, 3 days after the rain. on the bench in front of Tolliver's store. She heard of it there, on a market Saturday, standing at the counter working her $11.40 down by a dime, and Hoke was on the bench outside telling two other men that he would give $1 to any fool with a wagon who would go up and clear the rotten mast out of his fence corner and burn the brush while he was at it, and take the whole miserable woodlot off his hands and off his taxes into the bargain. And the men laughed, because who would want it? And Della Ames put down her dime and folded her list and went out onto the porch and said she would do it, and she would not take his $1. She would give him 7 of hers for the mast and the lot and the pile of stone in the middle of it. All of it, clear and done, if he would put his name to a paper saying so. The porch went quiet, and then it laughed. It laughed the way a crowd laughs at a thing it has already decided is pitiful, low and easy and sure of itself. The poor Ames widow spending 7 of her last dollars on 900 pounds of rot and a corner of briar, and Hoke laughed loudest because he could not believe his luck, and he said out loud that he would take a widow's $7 for a hog wallow any day God sent, and he sent a boy for the storekeeper to write it up. $7 for the 900 pounds on the ground and the woodlot it lay in, and the tumble of old stone at the center of it, sold as it stood, and Hoke set his name to it glad as a man selling snow, and Della Ames folded that paper the way a person folds a thing they mean to keep, in 4, along the creases, and put it inside her dress against her heart, and walked down the steps and out of the laughing with her chin held level, and did not answer any of it, and that was an answer. The laughter followed her a little way down the road, the way a dog follows, and then fell off behind her, and went back up onto the porch, to be enjoyed at leisure, and by supper, it was all over town that the Ames widow had spent 7 of her last dollars on Hoke's hog wallow, and they turned it over and over that evening, in their warm kitchens. Poor thing, gone soft with grief, throwing good money after rot, and they were sorrier for her than they had been before, and a little pleased besides, in the way people are quietly pleased by a thing that proves them right to have given up on somebody. She heard none of it, and would not have answered it if she had. She walked home with the paper folded flat against her heart and the light going down red behind the ridge, and at the table she got out the little book and wrote the date, and under the date she wrote $7, 900 pounds, the lot and the stone, and she drew a line under the last 3 words, though she could not yet have told you why she did. There was an old man at the far end of the bench who had not laughed. He was called Nary, Old Nary, and he had come from somewhere across the water so long ago that the town had stopped asking where. A small, dark-bent old man, who chopped wood and mended chairs and lived on nearly nothing at the edge of things. One more person the county was quietly sorry for, and he had come up out of a country of stone mountains, where the bread had always been made of chestnuts, because on the rock there was nothing else that would grow, and he had known hunger there of a kind the valley could not imagine. A winter when the chestnut crop failed, and half a village went into the ground, and he had lived because the ones before him had known how to make the fallen and the spoiled last. He got up off the bench while they were still laughing, and he came over to where she stood in the road, and he did not mock her, and his was the first voice in the whole of it that did not, and he bent down slow and picked one wind-fallen chestnut up out of the mud of the road, where it had dropped off somebody's boot, and he rubbed it clean with the ball of his thumb, around and around, until the brown of it shone, and he held it out to her flat on his open palm, and he told her one thing and then he stopped talking. What falls and what spoils feeds the patient, he said. That was all. He set the clean nut in her hand and closed her fingers over it and went back to his wood, and she kept the nut, and she kept the words, and both of them together were worth a good deal more than $7, though it would take 3 autumns to prove it. Now the method, which is the load-bearing middle of the matter, and which she did not know on the day she bought the mast and had to learn a nut at a time, and old Nary taught her the bones of it in an afternoon, and the trees taught her the rest over years. The secret of the chestnut is that it is not spoiled when it looks spoiled, and it is not ready when it looks ready, and everything turns on time. A green chestnut off the tree is half water and full of a starch that will not keep and will not grind. And if you try to hurry it, you get mold and mash and heartbreak. But if you dry it slow, if you lay the shelled nuts on a rack of split laths in a low, warm, smoky room, and keep a small fire going under them for weeks, turning them, watching them, letting the heat crawl into them and drive the water out a little at a time, then something happens inside the nut that no hurry can buy. The starch turns to sugar, The flesh goes hard and dry and sweet and light, and the tough inner skin loosens so it can be rubbed away, and a nut that would have rotted in a week on the ground becomes a hard, sweet stone that will keep a whole year in a dry crock, and can be ground between two stones into a fine pale flour the color of old ivory, and that flour is bread. It has no wheat in it and needs none. It makes a dense, dark, sweet loaf that carries a day's work in a single slice, and does not stale for a week, and does not mold for two, and every word of that is as true and as plain as arithmetic, and any baker who ever tried it would tell you the same, and that is why the thing could not be argued with once it existed. But it did not exist yet. It had to be made. 40 days of low fire at a stretch, and then the grinding, and then the baking, and then the tasting, and the writing down, and made again, and again, season after season, before it was any good at all. That first autumn was mostly failure, and she wrote every failure down. She hauled the 900 pounds off the hill in Tom's old handcart, load by load, and she shelled them until her thumbs bled and bound them and shelled more. And she dried the first batch too fast and scorched it, and dried the second too slow, in a corner of the 2 rooms, and lost a third of it to mold. And she ground what was left in a borrowed hand mill too coarse, and the first bread she made of it was a hard, sour brick that even the hens were slow about. But she tasted it, and she wrote down why it was bad. The heat too high the first week, and the grind too coarse, and the fire smoked with the wrong wood, so the taste went bitter. And she tried again with what she had learned, and the second bread was bad in a different way, which is how you know you are getting somewhere. By the deep of that first winter, she had a loaf that a hungry person could be glad of, dense and sweet and lasting, and she ate it herself all through the cold and gave the rest to old Neri, who ate it slowly with his eyes shut, and told her the fire wanted to be lower, and the drying wanted to be longer, and that in his country, they had a house for nothing but this. A little stone house with a slow fire, built apart so the smoke and the risk stayed away from where people slept. And she wrote that down too. A house for nothing but this. And she did not yet know she owned one. She found it the next spring, and the finding of it was the buried thing coming up to meet her. She had gone up to the grove to clear the brush as she had promised Hoke she would, and to see whether the standing trees would give her another crop she could cure better. And she took the mattock to the briar around the old rock pile at the center, meaning only to burn it off. And under the briar, the mattock rang on cut stone. She cleared it a day at a time, alone, through that spring and into the summer. And stone by stone a house came out of the woods. 4 square walls of dressed rock and a fallen slate roof, and a door hole and a hearth, and set into the thick of the far wall, sound and whole and dry as the day it was laid, the arched mouth of a brick oven, a baker's oven, deep and true, its firebox clean, its floor unbroken, kept 40 years by nothing but the skill of the dead man who built it. She stood in the door of it a long while, and then she did the only thing there ever was to do, which was to begin. She cleared the chimney of its nests, and mended the roof with the fallen slate, and split laths for drying racks, and laid them up along the walls. And she built her first small curing fire on that old hearth in that stone house, apart from where anyone slept, exactly and only the house that old Neri had told her his country kept for this and nothing else. And it was as though the man who planted the trees had left it standing for the one person patient enough to need it. And she wrote the date in the ledger, and under the date she wrote, "The oven draws true." The second autumn she cured the crop in the bakehouse the slow way. 40 days of low sweet fire of apple wood and chestnut wood, turning the racks by hand morning and night. And she ground it fine in a mill she had traded a winter's mending for. And the bread that came out of the old brick oven, that first true baking, was not a poor person's makeshift anymore. It was a thing in its own right, dark and close-grained and sweet, with a sweetness that was not sugar. A loaf that a laboring man could carry cold into the woods and eat at noon, and feel it hold him till dark. A loaf that kept a week in the box and longer. And she carried a basket of it down to the Saturday market not as a curiosity but as bread, and priced it fair, and sold a little, and the town bought it the way the town did everything about her that year, out of pity, to be kind to the widow, and then some of them came back the next Saturday not to be kind, but because the bread was good and lasted, and their own had not. And by the third autumn, there were men buying her chestnut bread, who had laughed on Tolliver's porch, and buying it because it was better and cheaper and kept. And that is the first undeniable evidence, the kind that cannot be talked out of, a thing men reach for a second time with their own money. And there was a proof in it that autumn that no amount of pity nor scorn could reach, because it was a proof you could hold in your hand and set on a shelf and come back to. A loaf of her chestnut bread did not go stale in 3 days the way wheat bread went stale, and did not mold in a week. It kept, hard and sweet and sound, a week and then 2 and then longer than that. And men who worked the far fields and the deep woods found it out for themselves, that a loaf carried out on a Monday was still good bread at Friday noon, when a wheat loaf would long since have been a green ruin, and that was a fact a laboring man's stomach kept better than any book. A teamster, hauling to the county seat, took a loaf for the 4 days of the trip and came back and bought 6. The miller's own foreman, who had laughed as loud as any man on the porch that afternoon, carried one into the woods on a timber cruise and ate the last of it a fortnight out still sound, and came up the hill himself with the money already in his fist, and did not quite look at her while he paid, and she took his coin and made her mark and said nothing of the porch, not that day nor any day. The bread had stopped being a sad woman's oddity and become a thing the county reached for on purpose, with money, a second and a third and a 10th time, and there is no argument anywhere on earth that stands up against that. A thing men buy again is a thing that works, and hers worked, and every soul who had said otherwise was, from that autumn forward, simply wrong, and the wrongness of them settled down quiet into the county's memory and waited there for the winter that would bring it all the way home. And there was a child in it by then, which mattered more than the market. A woman named Sella Poe had died in the second winter of the same low fever that took 2 others, and left a girl of 8, Prue, half-orphaned and passed hand to hand among neighbors, who each had too many mouths already, and the girl took to walking up to the grove because there was warmth there, and because Della Ames did not send her home. She carried water and split kindling and turned the drying racks when she was told, grave beyond her years and quiet as the work itself, and one evening, Della found her with the ledger open on her knee, copying the marks in a careful child's hand, getting the weights and the days down, keeping the record, and Della did not take it from her. She showed her instead how the tie string held the pencil so it would never be lost, and from that night the girl kept the book on the days Della's hands were in the dough, and the knowledge had somewhere to go now that was not the grave, and that too was a kind of proof, the kind you cannot sell and cannot lose. It was that 3rd autumn, with the bread selling and the grove in good order and the oven drawing true, that the man with the paper came up the hill, because value had appeared at last and men like him do not appear until it has. His name was Colvard, and he owned the big mill on the river and bought and sold the flour of half the county. A smooth, well-fed, well-spoken man in a good coat who called her Mrs. Ames, with a warmth he had practiced, and he came alone in a light buggy on a fine afternoon and stood in the door of the stone bakehouse, looking at the racks and the oven and the crocks of pale flour, with eyes that added while they admired. He was all regret and kindness. He said he had heard of her clever bread and admired what a woman alone had made of a hard lot, and that was just why he had come, because a thing like this was too much for one pair of hands and too fragile to trust to chance, and the winters were long, and the taxes on wild land were a cruel burden to a widow, and he would take it all off her shoulders. He would buy her whole baking at a set price the year round, a fair price, a generous price, more money than she had seen at one time since Tom died, and he would lease the ground so she needn't trouble herself with the title and the taxes and the worry of it, and she could go on baking with no care in the world but the baking, under his name, with his mill behind her, safe. He talked for a long time, the way such men do, laying the paper on the table and smoothing it with the flat of his hand, watching her face for the place where relief would break, and telling her over and over how much easier her life was about to become. She let him talk, because letting a man talk is a way of counting him, and she was counting him. She had learned long ago that a person tells you what he is if you will only give him rope enough and quiet enough, and Colvard had plenty of rope and she gave him all the quiet he wanted, and she watched his hands on the paper, and she watched his eyes go around the room to the crocks and the racks and the good oven, and she said almost nothing at all, and at last, sure now that he was winning, comfortable, reaching for the close, he made the one slip that men of paper always make, which is that they cannot keep from showing they have already been to the courthouse. He said she must not worry herself about the deed, that the title to a lot like this was very likely a tangle, old wild land, no clear line, and that a woman alone ought not to be left carrying such a snarl, and that he had looked into the matter himself as a friend would, and found the whole corner had been let go years back by Hoke for a trifle. $7, he believed it was, sold off for clearing, and that such a loose old sale would never stand if it were ever tried, and so much the better that a sound man was there to set it all straight for her. $7. She heard it, and she did not move, and she did not let it show on her face, but something in her went very still and very clear, the way the air goes clear before the season turns, because there was only one place in the whole world that Colvard could have learned that it had been $7. And that was the record, the written record, which meant he had gone to the courthouse and turned up the sale and read the figure and come away meaning to have the grove and the oven and everything in it, and had told himself the paper was too loose to hold, which meant he had known, longer than she had, that the worthless corner was worth having, which meant it had never once been worthless, and he was the proof of it, standing there in his good coat wanting it. She said only that she would want to think, and that she thanked him, and he left the paper and drove off well pleased, and she sat at the table a while in the cooling light, and then she took out from against her heart the thing she had folded in four on Tolliver's porch 3 autumns before, and carried every day since. Hoke's own bill of sale in his own hand, $7 for the 900 pounds on the ground and the woodlot it lay in, and the tumble of stone at the center of it, sold as it stood, signed and witnessed by the storekeeper, and she smoothed it flat on the table beside Colvard's, and it was not loose, and it was not a tangle, and it was not a snarl. It was a clean sale of the lot in fee, land, and stone and all, from the man who owned it to the woman who paid for it, before witnesses, and it was hers, and it had been hers the whole time he had been coveting it, and no mill on any river could touch it. She took it into town the next market day, not to Colvard and not to Tolliver, but to the courthouse itself, and she paid the clerk a fee. She counted out in dimes to have Hoke's paper recorded and copied into the county book in ink, so that it was written down twice now and forever. And she brought a fair copy of it up the hill and set it in a tin against the day anyone should ask, and then she sent Colvard's own paper back to him down the river unsigned, with 3 words written across the bottom of it in her small plain hand, and the 3 words were, "The land is recorded." That was the whole of her answer, and it was enough, because a man like Colvard, whose only weapon is that other people's papers are loose and other people cannot read them and other people have not kept the record, has nothing at all to say to a woman who has kept the record better than the county, and he did not come up the hill again, and he did not write again, and before the next winter was out he had sold his interest in the mill and gone to the county seat to be a smaller man among strangers, and that was the last the valley saw of the man in the good coat. She had beaten him without raising her voice, and without spending $1, and without ever once telling him he was beaten. She had beaten him with a piece of paper she had folded and kept for 3 years, because she was the kind of person who folds a thing she means to keep, and that is the only kind of person who ever wins that particular fight. Then came the winter that turned the whole county to her door, and it came the way such winters come, out of the sky, on everyone at once, and it did not touch her at all. That 3rd summer, a black rust got into the wheat across the whole valley and up both ridges, a red-brown blight that ran through the standing grain in a wet, warm spell and shriveled the heads to chaff, and what little was got in came in thin and light and musty, and would not keep. And the flour Colvard's old mill ground out of it soured in the barrel inside a month, and drew weevil besides, so that by the first hard frost there was hardly a sound sack of wheat flour in the county, and no money to buy sound flour from away, and no road fit to haul it in over if there had been. The corn had come in poor behind a dry June, the gardens were long spent, and the winter stood up in front of that valley the way the worst of them do, with the meal bins low and going bad, and Advent coming and nothing between a great many families and real hunger, but whatever a body could lay hands on that would keep, and the one thing in the whole county that would keep, the one bread that had no wheat in it to blight and did not sour and did not mold, and had been drying all autumn in a stone house on the hill, was hers. She had, by the count in the ledger, better than 3,000 pounds of cured chestnut flour laid by in crocks and tins that winter. 4 autumns of learning to gather and cure the crop of 40 old trees, and the young ones coming on behind them, and she could turn out from the old brick oven, working night and day with Prue turning the racks and keeping the book, more dark keeping loaves in a week than any one family could eat in a month, and the word went down the valley the way water goes down it, that up at the Ames Grove there was bread that kept, real bread, dark and sweet and filling, and that the widow was selling it. And here is the place where a smaller story would have had her give it all away, or gouge them for it, and she did neither, because she was no fool, and old Neri had not raised a fool. She set a fair price. A plain, honest price. Not a low one. The price of good bread in a hard year, and not a penny more, nor a penny less. And she held to it with the men who had money, the miller's foreman and the storekeeper, and the ones who had laughed on the porch. And she did not forgive them the price, and she did not need to, because the bread was worth it, and they knew it, and they paid. But to the ones who came up the hill with nothing, the ones the fever and the blight had emptied out, the half-orphaned and the old and the sick, she gave the same bread at the same fair price on credit, on a handshake, on a mark in the ledger, pay when you can, and no shame in it, and no interest on it ever, and she wrote each name down in the book in her small plain hand, under the weight of the loaf, not to collect it but to keep it, because keeping the record was the only way she knew to tell a man he was trusted, and that trust, and not the money, and not the winning, was the whole of what she had been working toward without ever once saying so, and it is the only thing in the story she would have called a victory, and she would not have called it that either. And so you come back around to the cold Sunday a week before Advent, and to the road full of the county standing in the milk-colored light with their hats in their hands, and now you know what they had not let themselves know, and every held-back thing can come down at last. The scrape you heard in the first dark was the bread peel on the floor of the old dead man's oven that the grove had led her to, drawing out the dark-keeping loaves. The line was every soul in the valley, the ones with money and the ones with nothing, come for the one bread the blight could not touch. The loaves were made of chestnuts, 900 pounds of wind-fallen chestnuts to start at 4 autumns back and the crop of 40 trees since, the very mast they had called spoiled waste, and rot on the ground, and hog feed gone soft in the wet. And the price of the whole beginning of it, the price of the mast and the lot and the stone house and the sound oven and the ground it all stood on, the price the porch had laughed itself sick over, had been $7. $7 and 900 pounds, and 3 autumns from the laughing to the line, and now the 3 numbers stood in the road, meaning the flat opposite of what they had meant, and not one man in that line was laughing, and the ones who had laughed hardest stood nearest the front with their hats crushed against their chests, wanting more than they had ever wanted anything to have been among the ones who believed her from the start, and knowing they had not been, and taking their hats off to her, because it was the only thing left that they could give. That is worth saying plainly, because a lesser soul would have, and she never did, not one word, not on that morning, nor any morning after. She only counted the loaves and made her marks and fed them, the ones who had money and the ones who had none, all winter long and through the Advent and out the far side of it into the spring. And the county came through that hungry year on chestnut bread and did not forget it, not ever. And after, when there was time again for things besides staying alive, the accounts of the story closed themselves one by one the way accounts do. Old Neri lived to see it, and she saw to it that he never split another stick of wood for his bread, nor spent another winter cold, and he took to sitting by the bakehouse oven in the good chair she gave him, with a loaf of the bread of his own country in his 2 hands, eating it slow with his eyes shut, and he died old and warm and fed, which is more than the valley had ever meant to give him, and she buried him at the head of the grove where the man who planted the trees most likely lay, and she cut his name in the stone herself so it would not be forgotten the way the other had been. Hoke, who had sold it all for $7, glad as a man selling snow, lived on down in the town and said less and less about that particular trade as the years went by. Colvard was gone and stayed gone. Tolliver's ledger she paid down at last and clean, the $11.40 and all the rest, in good coin, and she kept her own ledger to the end of her days, the cheap ruled book with the pencil tied on the string, the record of what was so. And Prue grew up. That is the last account and the one that mattered most, because a thing you know dies with you unless you give it away on purpose, and Della Ames gave hers away to the grave-eyed child the fever had left on her doorstep. Prue grew up in the grove and in the bakehouse and in the pages of the book, and she learned the whole of it, the gather and the cure, and the 40 days of low fire and the fine grind and the true oven, and she learned the other thing too, the fair price and the open hand, and the mark made not to collect but to keep. And when Della Ames was old and gray and content, and her hands were no longer sure on the peel, it was Prue who drew the loaves, and Prue who kept the record, and the knowledge had gone on ahead of its keeper into another life, which is the only way any of it ever lasts. She was very old the last autumn, and she still went up into the grove on the good days to sit under the trees she had come to own for $7. And one of those days, a young woman came walking up the hill she had never seen, a stranger, thin and worn, and carrying trouble in her face the way Della had once carried it. Come to ask about work or bread or she hardly knew what, some girl at the ragged end of her own hard year. And Della Ames watched her come the way she had watched everything. And when the girl stood in front of her not knowing what to say, the old woman bent down slower than she used to, and picked up one wind-fallen chestnut out of the leaf fall at her feet, and rubbed it clean with the ball of her thumb, around and around, until the brown of it shone, and held it out to the stranger flat on her open palm, and told her one thing, and then she stopped talking. "What falls and what spoils feeds the patient," she said. And she closed the girl's fingers over the clean nut the way old Neri had closed hers a lifetime before. And up in the high limbs of the old trees the wind moved, and a chestnut let go, and came down through the branches and landed soft in the leaves, and then another, and the sound of them falling went on after she had finished speaking, and went on falling, patient and endless and sure, and did not stop.